Joe Fortunato is on the line with us. It's time for Film School. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Jeanne. How are you, everybody?
I am fine, and I'm so excited because we're going to talk about one of my very favorite movies of all time. Yay! We're going to talk about the original Dune from back in 1984. I remember I actually went to the movies to see this, and I brought my then long-suffering boyfriend with me because he hated the movie, but I loved it. And so there we were. And
I know you do, and that's why we're doing it. And plus, it certainly ties in with the release of the second part of the new Dune remake that's in theaters now. And I guess it's probably fair to call this a cult favorite. It definitely has, although, and we'll talk about this, it was generally regarded as a failure or a flop, but it does have its fans like yourself and many other people, my brother-in-law, for instance. It was released December 14th, 1984, directed by the great David Lynch, written by Frank Herbert, who wrote the original novel, as well as David Lynch. It stars Brad Dourif, Kyle MacLachlan, Francesca Annis, Leonardo Cimino. It did have one Oscar nomination for sound. Its budget was about $40 million, and it earned about $31 million. So, like I said, it didn't earn back its keep, but it did earn some money. But David Lynch, the writer and director, said that he considers this movie the only real failure of his career. And even to this day, he kind of refuses to talk about the production in much detail. And his refused offers to work on a special edition DVD or a recut of the film. And despite the fact that he considers it a financial flop, it still is the David Lynch movie to make the most money in its initial box office run. So, I guess when you're playing in the big budget sci-fi thing, that's going to earn more money than some of his smaller, quirkier films. Some have even called it the Heaven's Gate of science fiction movies. And if people don't get that reference, Heaven's Gate is one of the all-time Hollywood failures and kind of shorthand for box office failure, which is not even fair because Heaven's Gate, and maybe that's something we'll talk about one of these days, Heaven's Gate cost $40 million, about the same, only earned $1 million back at box office.
Oh, my God.
That's a failure.
Wow.
And like I said, this movie cost $42 and earned back $31.
Well, this was the first time. This was the first time
without post-production effects, ran over 4 hours long, and David Lynch's intended cut was almost 3 hours long, and so there was a lot cut and left on the floor because Universal Pictures and the financiers said, "No, we're expecting a traditional, 2 hour plus traditional cut of the film," and so they really cut it down.
Well, and this was the first time we saw Kyle MacLachlan, who, David Lynch then put in Twin Peaks, right? Yeah, this is his film debut.
He was also in Blue Velvet, so he sort of became a David Lynch, favorite. I worked with him a lot. And, talking about David Lynch, before the making of this film, David Lynch turned down an offer to direct, get this, Return of the Jedi, telling George Lucas, hey, that's your thing, not my thing. So he turned down Return of the Jedi to do this. And I don't know, I guess history will decide if that was the right decision or not. It was a huge undertaking. So the total number of production crew was nearly 1,700 people. It had 80 sets built on 16 sound stages. Took more than 6 years in the making. David Lynch worked for 3.5 years. And, so it's just crazy. 53 speaking roles, 20,000 extras, 900 crew members. That's an undertaking for sure.
Well, and back then they really didn't have the CGI and the kind of advanced, visual effects that we have in today's movies. And I think that what made people disappointed in this movie, I know I was disappointed, was that the book was just so expansive in its vision of this future world, and it was so complicated. It was really hard to get it into a movie, especially with the kind of effects they had back then. Then you fast forward to Dune 1, the most recent Dune 1, and of course that had better effects, but they only did half of the story because it's just too big of a story to do in one movie.
Yeah, and, they kind of had the same problem when they were doing Lord of the Rings. It's a very expansive universe with a built-in fan base based on the novels, and you can do so much more in multiple novels like they did with Dune. Kind of tying into that, it's kind of interesting you brought that up, because in the original release of the film, the theaters had cheat sheets explaining much of the movie's setting and its obscure vocabulary, and it was handed out to moviegoers in some of the theaters. And Francesca Annis, who played Lady Jessica in the film, she sort of commented that she kind of had a negative impression when first watching the film herself, stating that, quote, any Hollywood film that has to explain itself in detail at the beginning is in trouble. And that kind of came to be true.
Well, right.
We talk about casting a lot, and there was some, as usual, most of the big Hollywood names were considered to play various roles. For that role of Princess Irulan was Jodie Foster, Brooke Shields, Kim Basinger, Melanie Griffith, Michelle Pfeiffer, Meg Ryan, Christy McNichol, Tatum O'Neal, Sarah Jessica Parker. All were considered for that role, and for the role of, and I'm going to mispronounce the name, Paul Atreides. Is that right?
Atreides, Paul Atreides. Yeah.
That was Val Kilmer, Tom Cruise, Kevin Costner were all considered for that role. So, it's always fun to speculate what might have been. Now, another casting note that I think is kind of funny is that this is an early film of Sir Patrick Stewart, who, of course, we know as Captain Picard mostly, but he was a pretty unknown person, or an unknown actor, at least in terms of the general public at the time. And his casting was actually a mistake. In a rush to replace another actor, David Lynch thought he was hiring a different person who was named Patrick Stewart, and it turned out to be our Patrick Stewart that got the role.
Right, and it was really, he plays Gurney Halleck, and it was really, I thought he did a really good job, and I kind of thought that because he was in this sci-fi movie as Gurney Halleck in the 1984 Dune, that's maybe why he got the nod for Star Trek eventually.
Yeah, I mean, that's, almost a decade later, but that's a pretty reasonable, assumption there. I think it certainly kind of put him more on the map to general mainstream audiences.
But one of the characters that you're not mentioning, which our audience will love and remember, is Sting. Sting was in this movie. It was a bit part, but it was cool.
Yeah, and he was originally supposed to have a nude scene. He was supposed to come out in a basically nude, and the filmmakers got nervous about that, even though he agreed to it, and they got nervous about that and had him cover up. So
yeah, they had him in a gold lame bikini.
Yeah, exactly.
That was something. Yeah, I mean, I watched this again. I mean, I got this recently because, I love all things Dune. And you watch it, it's pretty campy. It really is, especially because the special effects compared to today are very, very cheesy. But I still liked it. I really did still like it. One of the reasons I liked it is because you got to see the whole story instead of it being cut in half like the new movies.
Mm-hmm. And Frank Herbert sort of acknowledged that Lawrence of Arabia was an influence behind writing the novel. And Lawrence of Arabia is one of my favorite films. So I talked about directors. Sir David Lean, who directed Lawrence of Arabia, was actually offered to direct but turned it down. As I mentioned, Lawrence of Arabia was an influence on this. Another, kind of interesting director story that, according to his own biography, Jack Nicholson, at one point in the late 70s, considered directing Dune, but decided it was too much of an undertaking. And he also turned down some roles in the film. So there was, at one point, Jack Nicholson was going to bring it to the screen.
Right. And, when you talk about too much of an undertaking, didn't you say there were, thousands, literally thousands of people working on this and extras? Yeah,
exactly. And, maybe that's another reason that people consider David Lean, since that was kind of his area of expertise, were big Hollywood epics like Lawrence of Arabia, Bridge on the River Kwai, Dr. Zhivago, and so forth. But again, and he was getting older at the time, so maybe it wasn't the best take. Another person that had considered bringing this to the screen earlier on in the 70s was Alejandro Jodorowsky, who people, mainstream film goers, probably don't know, but he's a very quirky, avant-garde filmmaker, and they were he was going to bring it to the screen, and he was going to have Orson Welles as the Baron, Gloria Swanson as a role, and I like this part. The soundtrack was to be done by Pink Floyd.
Oh, that would have been cool, but I guess Toto did some of the Pink Floyd to this one.
Yeah, exactly.
Quite a bit of a difference.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, so as we wrap up here, are you now more interested in going back and revisiting this film because because I literally twisted your arm to get you to talk about it today?
Yeah, I might. And yeah, to pull back the curtain on this a little bit for our listeners, this was not my choice. This was Jeanne's choice, but I thought
you can blame me.
It is a cult favorite, and it is relevant, more relevant now than ever before because of the release of the remake. So yeah, I think it's fair that maybe I'll go back and give it another try.
All right, sounds great. Joe Fortunato, he is a film studies professor, and he takes us to film school every Friday at this time. I'm Jeanne Destro, in for Ray Horner. Time for Stephanie with traffic.